Hello and welcome to Lesson 2, Asch and the Variables that Influence Conformity. In today's lesson, we are going to look at some of the variables that affect conformity, including group size, unanimity, and task difficulty. We're also going to look at Asch's original experiment and the variations he conducted to investigate these three elements. So, Asch in 1954 developed what's referred to as the Asch paradigm, which involves a series of confederates and one real participant, a naive participant. The setup is such that the confederates are already sitting around the table when the real participant enters. He's a little late. He sits down. The participants are shown a comparison line and three target lines, and they have to decide which of these three lines is the same length as this one. The answer is always, on these critical trials, obvious. Unbeknownst to this poor chap, the naive participant, everyone who's involved in the critical trial, in this case, every one of these confederates have already been instructed by the experimenter to give a deliberately and obviously wrong answer. So they go around the table and they say, okay, which line is this one the same length as? And this chap here says A. And the participant raises an eyebrow. This guy says A. Now he's got two eyebrows. This fella says A. Now his eyebrows are trying to escape his face, and they go around, and by the time they get to this real participant, in 37% of the cases, he says A as well. He gives an answer he knows to be wrong in order to fit in with the group. So that's the Asch paradigm. There's a lot more detail in the guide notes. Pause it, have a look. Asch's experiment was laboratory based. That means that he had direct manipulation of an independent variable. He could control any extraneous variables such as environmental factors like light, heat, the amount of time that the lines were presented, which lines were presented. He could control things like what the confederates said, where they sat, and all that sort of stuff. So he had a huge amount of control over the study. Randomization is also an important part of the laboratory experiment. Replication of Asch. Strict controls meant that Asch could repeat his study several times, manipulating different variables in the trial. So his overall conformity rate was about 37%. And it's really important to be able to replicate a study in science. If you can't replicate it, then it could have just been a fluke. When you replicate something, the more times you carry out, the more reliable that study is. There is a flip side to replication, though, is that sometimes when you replicate your study, you don't find the same results. And that's a problem. So Perrin and Spencer, for example, replicated Asch's study and found a conformity rate of less than 1%. So really low. Ecological validity then. Ecological validity is another concept that we associate with lab experiments, and in Asch's example it's particularly salient. When we're talking about ecological validity, we're really talking about the degree to which our research can be generalized beyond the laboratory. Now, the problem is if it's a highly controlled artificial situation with an artificial task, then can we really say, okay, people behave the same ways under those conditions that they do, for example, when they're involved in workplace bullying? Is that the same thing, judging a length of a line and going along with the Nazi party? Are these the same? In Asch's case, consider what the real-life consequences were of judging the line wrong. Minimal. Compare that to medical professionals who conform and give the wrong medication. That has more real-life consequences. Independent behaviour. One criticism of Asch's experiment is that it focuses on those who conform, but those who conform were actually the minority, 37%. 75% conformed on at least one trial, but crucially 25% never conformed on any trial. And on average, around 60% didn't conform. This suggests that majority influence is not as strong as it might seem. Focus on small majorities. Another limitation of the stage, so these are all evaluation points for Asch's original experiment, and some of his subsequent ones as well, is they tend to focus on small majorities, 3 to 5. In one case, Asch used 15, but really not much more than that. Imagine we want to describe or explain conformity in a riot situation or at a football match. These are majorities that are so huge, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people influencing you. Asch's paradigm doesn't really, may not be able to explain those, and therefore it lacks validity in terms of being able to be applied to the real world. Ethics. This is a big one, and it's an issue for social influence research overall. Asch deceived the participants. He told them they were taking part in a visual perception task. They weren't. He couldn't have told them the real truth, because if he had told them the truth, they would have behaved differently. Because they weren't told the truth, though, they couldn't give informed consent. And many of them felt anxious and were sweating, shaking. And it's just possible that if they had had an opportunity to know what they were getting into, they may have actually decided not to take part. They may also have felt embarrassed about taking part. So it's important for the experimenter to protect them from psychological harm, to debrief them fully, and to ensure that any issues are followed up later. So, variables affecting conformity. In the original experiment, you had a number of confederates who gave wrong answers, and this affected the answer that the naive participant gave. Asch realised that actually there are lots of factors that might influence it, and he picked out 3. He asked the question, what happens if we increase the number of confederates or decrease them? What happens if we break the unanimity of the confederates? And what happens when we change the difficulty of the task? So, science. In one variation, Asch tried out different numbers of confederates. So, along with the participant, there was 1 confederate, 2 confederates, 3 confederates, 4, and so forth. When there was only 1 confederate, when the number of confederates was only 2, conformity rates were at 13%, and when the confederates were 3, and 3 to 5 is really the optimum, the conformity rates were about 33%. Interestingly, in one condition, Asch actually increased the number of confederates to 15, and this led to a slightly lower conformity rate. This could be because participants thought or started to become suspicious. You know, a huge group like that, and they've all got exactly the same answer. Cabell and Ferry, 1989. Essentially, they distinguish between 2 tasks. One, a personal preference task, for example, how much you like a band, and the other, a task that requires a correct answer. In the personal preference, conformity and size had a linear progression. In other words, as one went up, the other also went up. Unanimity and dissenters. Asch included a dissenter in his conformity study, and the conformity rate dropped drastically to just 5.5%. He argued this is because the dissenter supports the petition, increasing the participants' confidence that they're correct. Essentially what they're doing is backing them up. The dissenter also breaks the united front of the rest of the group, and this happens even if the dissenter gives a different wrong answer to the majority. It's enough to take solace that you're not the only one whose opinions deviate from the norm. Task difficulty. So Asch varied the difficulty of the task, making the lines much closer in length, so it was more difficult to distinguish between the lines. Remember, in the original study, it was very easy to see which line was the same length as the target line. So if we link back to the dual process model from lesson 1, what we're saying is, when the task is relatively obvious, the answer is obvious, it's more of a normative social influence. However, when the task becomes more difficult, this becomes more informational. So further research by Rossander investigated conformity of people who use these internet communities, part of these internet communities such as Facebook and Twitter. Participants were asked questions about general knowledge and logic. Half the participants were provided with incorrect answers via confederates. They were provided with the influence of incorrect confederates similar to those used by Asch. The results showed that conformity to incorrect answers increased with task difficulty. So this backs up Asch's variation findings. Further research, in the specification it says you need to know task difficulty, unanimity and group size, but it's also worth noting that conformity rates differ, for example, between cultures. So in the UK we found a conformity rate of about 25%, but in collectivist China in 2006 the conformity rate was much higher at 37%. So the conformity rate in China 10 years ago is the same that it was in the United States 50 years ago. So it's quite significant. Age also matters. You are at your most independent when you're in your 40s and 50s. Younger you are, the more easily influenced, and the older. There are also gender differences in conformity, and I will probably host a geek club on that. Research by Allen is worth looking at. It's in your guide notes. Read it carefully. Strong evidence for task difficulty and expertise. Exam style questions. Okay, for next lesson you will have to have an answer to each of these questions. We'll go through them at the beginning and we'll give you some model answers. So you'll need to write the answers to the following questions, clearly title and date it. Today we're looking at variables influencing conformity, so please put an appropriate title. Do not write on the guide notes, use a separate sheet of A4. We'll analyse the results, as I said, or the answers next lesson, and we'll build up some really good answers, and we'll get you really hot on answering questions according to specification requirements, but also developing your wider basic essay writing and analysis skills and descriptive skills too. You may need to pause it for each question, write the question, and then answer it, press play. Or you can write all the questions at once and do them. Question 1 is purely an AO1 question. Requires you to describe, so that's in detail. Remember, it has to be specific, coherent, use examples, and so forth. Briefly describe Asch's variation that investigated the size of the group and its influence on conformity rates. 4 marks. Briefly describe Asch's variation that investigated the size of the group and its influence on conformity rates. 4 marks. So this one's an AO2 style question. Remember, AO2 is all about applying your knowledge, extracting key information from the stem. If you just describe one variable affecting social influence without reference to this stem, you will get 0 marks. So here's the scenario. Izzy is taking part in an end of topic quiz in psychology. The last question is, which explanation of conformity best describes the behaviour in Asch's study? The rest of the group all say it is informational social influence, but she knows it is normative. When they ask her, she says informational social influence, in agreement with them. Explain her behaviour in terms of one variable affecting social influence. Explain her behaviour in terms of one variable affecting social influence. AO2, another AO2 question here, 3 marks again. Just before they submit their final answer, so we're still talking about Izzy. Just before they submit their final answer, Lauren returns from the toilet and states, it's normative social influence. The majority disagree, but Izzy says, yeah, she is right. Explain the change in Izzy's behaviour in terms of one variable affecting conformity. 3 marks. AO3 question. Give one ethical and one methodological criticism of Asch's study. 4 marks. Give one ethical and one methodological criticism of Asch's study. 4 marks. Now remember, you need to use PE in your evaluation. That's structure. Methodological refers to how the study was carried out, so it deals with things like validity, the type of experiment, and everything like that. In this case, both evaluations must be criticisms of the study. Okay. Now bring those answers with you next lesson. We're going to share them, and we're going to build up some really good answers and really get you cracking on those skills. In today's session, just under 20 minutes, you have learned Asch's study and the strengths and limitations. Variables that influence conformity include size of majority, unanimity, and task difficulty, and some extended learning. Hope you enjoyed it, or at least got something out of it. I look forward to seeing you next time.